Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today I'm going to discuss with you some reasons you may wish to consider relocating to a less developed country. Now, this, some people might seem like a good idea intuitively, and some people might seem like a bad idea. I think, it can go either way, obviously, with any country. There's plenty of reasons to go to a more developed country, but usually that comes with some baggage, depending on the country. And there's some reasons to go to a less developed country, and there's some consequences there. But I want to give a few different thoughts that you've probably thought of, and a few different thoughts that you probably haven't thought of that might be useful for you, and keep it in mind for as you go forward. So let's dive in. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notifications. I really appreciate your subscription. Appreciate if you support the channel. Thank you very much. Please share it with your friends. And if you'd like help with the things that we help with here, which are international tax optimization, asset protection, forming companies, opening bank accounts, getting residencies, getting citizenships, citizenship by descent, unofficial citizenship, citizen by investment, etc. All those different options, please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so why go to a less developed country? Now, obviously there's some sort of a spectrum here, right? You could go to some place that's just pure, abject, undeveloped poverty in Africa, and I personally wouldn't do that. Some people might, but I personally wouldn't be my choice. And then you could go to like places like Switzerland, and there's then a broad spectrum in between. So there is somewhat of a relative scale of less developed. But I think specifically I want to focus on low wage countries. Okay, so low wage countries and countries that are maybe not quite as organized. So usually, not always, but usually these types of countries have a lower cost of living. So right off the bat, you can say, all right, great, pretty obvious. You would want to go there because you want a lower cost of living. All right, great. Next, very often you're in a situation where, at least in the case of a bunch of these countries, you can sometimes get more favorable tax treatment, etc. Now, often that comes with the trade-off that there is maybe less public services, right? So, you can look at that from different ways. You can say, okay, well, the value of goods and services that are being provided by my country based on my income is really not commensurate with what I'm paying. So there's that one side of it. And hey, here I'm actually getting kind of a more fair representation. On the other hand, you might say, well, hey, listen, there's a lot of appeal to that. And that is true, okay? So certainly there's trade-offs on there. The two things that I think are more underappreciated, and the one is more long-term, but in general, is first of all, generally countries that are what I would call less developed are places where you can kind of slip between the cracks better. If I just look at a lot of the places that have been more open in the last year and a half, they're generally not the most developed countries. So in most cases, again, there's exceptions to every rule and it goes either way, etc. But usually a lot of the places that are the most open have been less developed. And there's a really interesting analogy. A friend of mine, a number of years back, went to China. And I remember he came back, Anyway, he came back to Canada after being there for like 6 weeks, and he said he spent the first weekend being angry because he was in northern China. Okay, so some context there, right? But he said he felt much more free there than in Canada. Interesting, right? And he described it as, Canada is a country of laws. There things were flexible. And I think this is true in a bunch of these countries, right? So if you go to a bunch of places, your ability to operate is like somewhat, like there's a clearly defined box, and that can have benefits, right? Like that certainly from like a structural standpoint, I'll give you an example in a second, can make things easier. For example, a good friend of mine years ago was from Ukraine. He'd had a fairly successful air conditioning and like HVAC company in Ukraine. They would import products from Turkey. And one of the challenges that he faced was every time they would go and import product, when they got to the border, there was basically like a bribery process that would go on. The border guards would hold the things up, and they had to negotiate what the terms were to bring this in. He said every time it was different, it was a hassle, et cetera, and it created a ton of friction and uncertainty for the business, right? So this is an example of where actually that environment adds friction and makes it worse. And he ultimately left there and moved to Canada and went on to do his things in Canada. So that's some contrast, all right? Now, on the flip side, if we look at it, we could say, well, your ability to go unnoticed, to not have to worry about somebody being in your business, et cetera, can be much greater in some of these countries. And so I think for a certain group of people anyway, that's an appealing thing, right? A lot of people would rather be in an environment where, hey, the rules are negotiable, where there's less, even in cases where maybe the rules are more strict, they're less enforced, there's less oversight, et cetera. And in the world today, sometimes that's a harder thing to come by. So that's an advantage. To me, though, the biggest one that I think is interesting is this thought experiment I've been running. I did a video on this a while ago, and I'll pose it to you guys here, and then I'd love to hear in the comments what you think. And this is, if you were to think, okay, which countries in the world with a high degree of probability are likely to be dramatically better 10 years from now than they are today, which would those countries be? Okay. And you can think of different mental models, and that's a whole fun exercise, I think, to try and break down, like, what is it that makes some place get better or worse, et cetera. To me, I think about the changing labor trends, okay? And who the winners are going to be and who the losers are going to be. So interestingly enough, contrary to popular belief, the 20th century actually saw a massive increase in wealth disparities, not a decrease. What happened, though, was that those increases occurred between nations and rather than within nations. Okay, so say within some place like the US, there might have been relatively decent middle class. We saw this especially kind of in the post-war era, et cetera. In kind of the industrial factory worker type environment, we saw, like I said, a pretty strong middle class that formed amidst high productivity, lots of innovation, et cetera, and then unions allowing individuals to capture a larger share of that value, right? By contrast, the gap between, say, the US and various different, say, Southeast Asian countries, et cetera, grew dramatically, okay? So it was clear that you were best off to be in the places that were accelerating in this regard, right? That was a clear win. On the flip side, though, if we fast forward today, what are we seeing? We're seeing like a reconstruction of that environment to a case where human capital matters a lot more, ingenuity, innovation, your ability to sit down with a computer and code something and then have that scale up to an incredible degree. All of this stuff has a much greater payoff and doesn't require the same level of resources or the same level of infrastructure and support structure as it did in the past. And what this therefore means is that over time, the relative winners are going to be those who have not traditionally succeeded. So in other words, whereas the gaps previously were between nations, they're now going to be the opposite. It's going to be the gaps are going to grow within nations and decrease between nations, okay? What is that inevitably going to do? There's some different consequences of this. First of all, that creates a degree of unrest, right? If you have a group of people who historically are used to doing pretty well, who suddenly aren't doing that well, those people tend to be upset. They're displaced. There's lots of different negative social consequences that come from that. And that makes it a much less appealing place to live. And I think we kind of see that with the US, right? The US is probably the leading example of a place where you're having a whole pretty large base of the population who are essentially what you might call left behind, right? You might say they're displaced by globalization, and this fuels the rise of nationalism to some extent, right? People say, hey, listen, I was used to getting a pretty good deal. I'm no longer getting a pretty good deal. I feel ripped off. I feel like I'm losing out to globalization, so I'm going to focus on a hyper-nationalist policy, when in reality, you can do that for a short time, but ultimately, these are grander forces that are going to just, render your lack of competitiveness kind of inert, right? And so that's not so good. On top of that, when you see certain people who are big winners and certain people who are losers, that creates a certain resentment, which creates its own set of social challenges that arise, right? So it doesn't make for the most amazing place to live. By contrast, if you were to go to places like Eastern Europe and you were to look at the rate of wage increase, it's been going up really fast. In some cases in Bulgaria, it's been 10% a year, right? What does that do for our country? Well, these are by and large normal people who are seeing these wage increases, and it's basically fueled by the differential between these developed countries and these undeveloped countries, right? You look, again, I'm in Bulgaria today, there's a lot of call centers in Bulgaria. Now, call centers are a relatively low skill job, right? Which means that somebody in more or less any part of the world can do it fairly easily. And so if you have a reasonable legal structure, you have reasonable base of employees, etc., you can outsource things there, which they have done. And the result is a lot of people who would normally have been making, 500 euros a month, make 1,200 euros a month, right? That then creates lots of resources within the country that elevate people's standards. You're still in a low-cost environment, and so relatively speaking, this has been positive. This also creates new markets, which facilitates the creation of more services, which then improves that place quite dramatically over time, assuming they don't mess it up, which they might mess it up, right? But that's the case. So I think that it's worth considering, if you're going to go and live someplace, being in some place that is going to improve rather than some place that's going to decline, particularly if you're going to set some sort of roots, right? And of course, there's lots of different factors to improvement and decline. It's not all about this, but I would argue that one of the biggest ones is this, who's going to win on the wage standards. There's this kind of common statistic that gets repeated, which is in real terms, the average wages in the US have not increased since 1973. It's somewhat disingenuous because they peaked in 1973. They basically went down till about 1990, and then they actually have been raising relatively steadily since then. But the whole point is that what really happened during that time, the real story is not that wage growth has been flat or negative on inflation-adjusted terms, but actually that the wage growth has gone overseas. Because during that time, you had how many 100 million people come out of extreme poverty in China, right? What has been the rise of China has been the decline for a lot of people in some place like the US. And so the question is, where are they going to see these rises and declines? And I would argue it's these places that have really great kind of like human potential, right? And they're like sufficiently attractive from an infrastructure and legal structure standpoint that they attract this capital from around the world and drive this progress, which then is going to have a ripple effect outward. So I think it's worth at least checking out those places, having yourself partially connected to there, because do you want to be in a place that's improving, or do you want to be in a place that's not? I don't necessarily buy in general the idea that you should be in just one place. I think that years ago I was living in Costa Rica during the winters, and I kind of had this notion that I couldn't find the perfect place in the world. So I said, okay, there's like no perfect place, but maybe there's like the perfect 3 places, right? That if you alternate between them, it can work out well, or 4 places or 2 places, whatever. Usually it had something to do with following the weather and something like that. But anyway, something to consider when you're looking at it is which places stand to see the biggest wage increases versus which ones are likely to see wage decreases simply due to the rebalancing effects of global markets, in particular facilitated by information technology. So I hope that helps. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.